Thank you. Well, in May, you will have a special congregational meeting to elect a ministerial search committee to spend a year searching for a new settled minister to recommend to your congregation. Now, in preparation for that process, I want to tell you the story of another church's experience selecting ministers. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, was founded in 1877. It's located near the Alabama State Capitol. From the beginning, Dexter Avenue operated as a deacon's church, which means that the lay officers of the church were free to call any preacher they wanted without regard to bishops assigning them a minister or other church hierarchy beyond them choosing who their leader would be. In 1948, the 300-member church was looking for a new minister. Now, that summer of 1948, Alabama State, a public historical black university in Montgomery, Alabama State hired a new music professor, Antona Trent Johns. The deacons at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, many of whom worked at Alabama State University, invited her husband, the Reverend Vernon Johns, to deliver a trial sermon. Reverend Johns did so, and he so impressed the deacons that they offered Reverend Johns the position of minister without any further investigation and without a second trial sermon. Many years later, one of the deacons said that during his trial period at the church, Reverend Johns was very professional. He displayed that type of intelligence that would fit the congregation. His Master's of Divinity degree was from the University of Chicago Divinity School. We had a different Vernon Johns to start with, but after having been there for a period of time, the real Vernon Johns came out. And of course, we were stuck with him then. Well, I've collected stories, mostly that I found in the book Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch, and on the internet, I've collected stories about Reverend John's ministry, most of which are probably true. After arriving, Reverend Johns replaced the small sign in front of the church with a much bigger one, which he then used to announce his sermon topics to anyone passing by, including people on their way to the state capitol. One title of one sermon was "Segregation After Death." Now, the police saw the sign and called him to the station to explain the sermon title, "Segregation After Death." He told the police that he did not believe there would be segregation after death because all the whites who support segregation in this life were going to hell. In the spring of 1949, a series of murders occurred. In one, a white man on his porch shot a black man running down the street. The white man got his double-barreled shotgun and shot the black man dead. He said, if he was running, he must have done something wrong. The black leadership in the community grumbled behind closed doors. They voiced no public protest, with one exception. The following week, Reverend Johns posted on the sign outside his church this sermon topic: "It is safe to kill Negroes in Montgomery." It is safe to kill Negroes in Montgomery. Well, this made the newspapers. Newspapers reported that Johns was going to speak this sermon Sunday morning. The white community was up in arms. An all-white grand jury was then in session. They charged that Vernon Johns was inciting people to riot, and they subpoenaed him to appear. Johns appeared in court and answered the questions put to him, carefully pointing out that a black man had indeed been shot and killed in broad daylight, that nothing had been done to bring his murderer to justice, and that until an arrest was made, the words on the signboard outside his church were no more than a statement of fact. It is safe to kill Negroes in Montgomery. A judge decided to let Johns deliver the sermon because he thought it would be the lesser evil, saying, "The whites of Montgomery will pay more attention to you if I stop you." Saturday night before the sermon, someone burned a cross in front of the church. The service was packed with people. The police parked across the street from the church. Occasionally they would rev the engines of their police cars to try to drown out the sermon inside. Johns raised all the church windows so that people who couldn't get into the church because it was so crowded, people standing outside could hear what he was saying. In the sermon, he predicted that violence against Negroes would continue as long as they let it happen. Johns said, "Last week a white man was fined for shooting a rabbit out of season. But of course, it's safe to murder Negroes. A rabbit is better off than a Negro." I'll tell you why it's safe to murder Negroes. Because Negroes stand by and let it happen. No one could predict what to expect from Vernon Johns when he stepped into the pulpit. Unlike me, he didn't have a manuscript. He just stepped into the pulpit and started preaching. Whatever came into his mind, he said. One Sunday, heads turned to watch as Dr. Trenholm, president of Alabama State University, the largest employer of Montgomery blacks in general, and of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church members in particular, Dr. Trenholm, President Trenholm, arrived late and eased himself into a pew. Reverend Johns said from the pulpit, "I want to pause here in the service until Dr. Trenholm can get himself seated on his semi-annual visit to the church. Dr. Trenholm never returned to Dexter Church while Johns was its minister. On his days off, Johns sold fish and vegetables to members of the community. He felt that university faculty people were consumers but not producers, and real producers are folks who grew things on their farms. And he started a garden in the parsonage, in the backyard of the parsonage. On Sunday, he would hold up vegetables for all the congregation to see. And he would say, "Now, just to show you what can be produced on a small piece of land, I grew this in the back of the parsonage, and I left the roots on to prove that they are not store-bought." According to one story, Johns was officiating at an elegant wedding ceremony. This is a story that Coretta Scott King liked to tell. Johns was officiating at an elegant wedding ceremony for one of the most outstanding Negro families in Montgomery, in the church. Just before the marriage was final, just before the end of the wedding ceremony, he stopped. He looked up and he said, "I would like to announce that right after the wedding, there will be a watermelon cutting in the church basement. It will be 25 cents a slice. And for all of you economically minded people who order half a melon, the price will be $1.50. Then without stopping, Reverend Johns continued, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The end came when Vernon Johns drove onto the campus of Alabama State University with a truckload of watermelons to sell. The Board of Deacons met after this event and recommended that the church end his ministry. In a tense meeting, the Dexter congregation agreed by majority vote. He continued to live in the parsonage. The board turned off the electricity and the gas. To keep warm, he burned back copies of the New York Times, to which he subscribed and had saved for years. He wore 2 or 3 sweaters to bed and several pairs of socks. Nevertheless, he shivered all night. His wife resigned her position as the music professor at Alabama State University and took a new position at a university in Virginia, leaving her husband in the cold parsonage. Johns finally left Montgomery and retired from the ministry. He was now in his early 60s, to live on a farm in Virginia. Now, in Virginia, he gave support and advice to his niece, Barbara Rose Johns. This 16-year-old was attending an all-black segregated school in Virginia, a high school. And she organized a student strike. She placed an anonymous phone call to the principal saying that there was a student in trouble at the police station and the principal needed to go there immediately. And the principal left the school, and with the principal out of the school, she called all 450 African-American students to the auditorium where they announced that the school was now on strike and students were no longer going to attend classes until they received equal quality education compared to the white students in the other high schools. She was, of course, her friends were suspended and she was expelled from the high school for this student strike. But the NAACP agreed on her behalf to sue the school board on grounds of discrimination. And her case was consolidated with 4 other cases from around the country. And they became Brown versus the Board of Education. She was 16. But meanwhile, back in Alabama, at Dexter Baptist Church, the deacons were searching for a new minister. Now, search committees often make decisions based on their feelings about their previous minister. If they love their previous minister, they may try to find someone similar. But if the previous minister had a vision of the church that was different from most of the congregation, search committees will try to find a new minister who is completely different from the previous minister. Now, Vernon Johns was 56 years old when they first called him in 1948. To replace him, the deacons looked at a 25-year-old, right out of seminary, a graduate of Crozer Theological Seminary, the Baptist seminary located about 7 miles south of here. After Crozer, the young man had gone on to get a doctorate from Boston University School of Theology. He titled his dissertation, "A Comparison of the Conceptions of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman." And Wyman was a Unitarian. This intellectual dissertation, now that looked good to the deacons, who were themselves often faculty at a black university in Montgomery. So shortly after his 25th birthday, on January 24th, 1954, the young man delivered a trial sermon at Dexter. As the pulpit committee shepherded him around the church, they told him stories about Vernon Johns, a militant guy who had exalted the congregation to get involved in social issues. They explained to the 25-year-old that members of Dexter tended to accept the status quo. The social action blacks, they said, went down the street to Reverend Ralph Abernathy's church. After the weekend visit, the deacons offered, and the young minister accepted the position at Dexter. His name, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. During the first 15 months of King's ministry, he got to know the people of the church. He preached on Sundays. He reorganized the administration of the church. He expanded the programming of the church. He became friends with Ralph Abernathy, the young minister at First Baptist in Montgomery. Abernathy explained the difference between his church, First Baptist, and the Dexter church. He said, Abernathy put it this way: at First Baptist, you may talk about Jesus. At Dexter Baptist, they would prefer that you talk about Plato or Socrates or somebody like that. And if you just happen to mention Jesus, they would like you to do it just as quietly and briefly as possible. These first 15 months of his ministry, getting to know the church and the community, were the most serene and uncomplicated of Reverend King's adult life. But the serenity ended on December 1st, 1955, when the police arrested Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, for her refusal to surrender her seat to a white person on a bus. 5 days later, King was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. The The evening of Monday, December 5th, 1955, the 26-year-old minister, whom his congregation had called and hoped that he would not be controversial, spoke to 5,000 people about the Montgomery bus boycott. He said, "No one must be intimidated to keep them from riding the buses. Our method must be persuasion, not coercion. We will only say to the people, let your conscience be your guide. Our actions must be guided by the deepest principles of the Christian faith. Once again, we must hear the words of Jesus, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despise you. If we fail to do this, our protests will end up as a meaningless drama on the stage of history, and its memory will be shrouded in the ugly garments of shame. If you protest courageously, and yet with dignity and Christian love, future historians will say, there lived a great people, black people, who injected new meaning, new dignity into the veins of civilization. Well, within weeks, the boycott tested his courage and his trust in nonviolence. The night of January 30th, 1956, in the middle of a speech to a mass meeting, he received word that someone had bombed the parsonage, the same parsonage that Vernon John had lived in. Someone had bombed the parsonage while his wife and baby girl were inside. He left the speaker's platform and went home immediately. At the parsonage, he found that his wife and child were all right. Around his home was a crowd of angry blacks, and he spoke. I want you to go home and put down your weapons. We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence. Remember the words of Jesus, he who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop, because God is with this movement. Go home with this glowing faith and this radiant assurance. Now, these are some of the finest moments in the history of American religion. We know that Reverend King was not a perfect man. In the 1960s, the FBI circulated stories of King having affairs. In 1991, an academic inquiry concluded that King had plagiarized portions of his doctoral dissertation. Reverend King's sister, Christine Ferris, wrote, "My brother was no saint, but an average and ordinary man." And a close friend of Dr. King wrote that by exalting the accomplishments of Martin Luther King Jr. in a legendary tale that is annually told, we fail to recognize that his humanity, his personal and public struggles are similar to yours and to mine. Well, as you can see from this story, when a church calls a minister, knowing for sure what will happen next is impossible. Reverend Vernon Johns was a great preacher. He was a prophet with the courage to speak up about the injustices that he saw around him. Still, to put it mildly, he lacked diplomacy. In the end, this led to his departure. Dr. King was more of an intellectual, fitting in with the members who worked at Alabama State University. However, after Rosa Parks refused to move on that bus, Dr. King joined in supporting her, and he transformed his ministry and his life. As you think about who you would like as your next settled minister, I encourage you, I invite you to be open to many possibilities. There are older persons in our ministry, like Reverend John's, who are courageous, prophetic preachers. And they all have more diplomatic skills than Reverend John had. There are young students in our seminaries who have the potential for the kind of leadership that Dr. King had. None of these ministers, old or young, will be perfect. But each of them will have their own special strengths. So please be open to many possibilities. And know that after your new minister arrives, as time passes, there will be challenges you cannot predict and you cannot control. You and your next minister will face these challenges together. Let's sing our